The temporal photograph, a folklorist discovery, the discovery. Dr. Margaret Whitmore adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses and leaned closer to the dusty photograph that had been sitting in the university's folklore archive for decades. As the head of the Department of Cultural Anthropology at Miskatonic University, she had examined thousands of historical images, but something about this particular photograph made her pause. The black and white image, dated 1962, showed what appeared to be a simple family gathering in front of a modest farmhouse. 5 people stood in a line: an elderly man with a weathered face, a middle-aged woman in a floral dress, 2 children who couldn't have been more than 10 years old, and a young man in his 20s wearing a military uniform. Nothing unusual at first glance, just another snapshot from rural America during the early 1990s. But Margaret had been studying this photograph for 3 weeks now, and each time she looked at it, something seemed different. It had started innocuously enough. The photograph had been donated to the university by the estate of Harold Pemberton, a local historian who had spent his life collecting artifacts from the surrounding New England countryside. Among his collection were hundreds of photographs, documents, and personal items that painted a picture of life in rural Massachusetts. Spanning nearly 2 centuries, Margaret had been cataloging Pemberton's collection when she first encountered the photograph. The accompanying documentation was sparse, just a small note card that read, Hartwell Family 362, Dunwich Road Property. Donor Anonymous. Note: examined carefully over time. The cryptic notation had intrigued her. In her 15 years as a folklorist, Margaret had learned to pay attention to such mysterious annotations. They often led to the most fascinating discoveries about local legends, family histories, and cultural phenomena that might otherwise be lost to time. She had initially photographed the image with her digital camera for the archive's database, noting the standard details: approximate age, condition, subject matter, and historical context. The Hartwell family name was familiar to her. They had been one of the founding families of the area, with roots stretching back to the colonial period. But it was during her second examination of the photograph that Margaret noticed something that made her question her own perception. The elderly man in the image, she could have sworn, he had been standing on the left side of the group. Now, however, he appeared to be positioned on the right, next to the woman in the floral dress. Margaret had initially dismissed this as a simple mistake on her part. After all, she examined dozens of photographs each week, and it would be easy to confuse details between different images. But the feeling nagged at her, so she decided to compare the photograph with her digital copy. The discrepancy was undeniable. In her digital photograph, taken just 2 weeks earlier, the elderly man was clearly positioned on the left side of the group. In the physical photograph before her, he was just as clearly on the right side. Margaret stared at both images for nearly an hour, checking and rechecking the details. The clothing was the same. The facial expressions were identical. The lighting and shadows matched perfectly. Everything was exactly the same, except for the position of that one figure. As the days passed, and Margaret continued to study the photograph, more changes became apparent. The young man in the military uniform, who had initially been standing at attention with his hands at his sides, now appeared to have his left hand raised slightly, as if caught in the middle of a gesture. The 2 children, who had been standing close together, now seemed to have more space between them. Most disturbing of all, the expressions on their faces seemed to be subtly shifting. The woman's smile, which had appeared warm and genuine in Margaret's first examination, now seemed forced, almost strained. The elderly man's eyes, which had been looking directly at the camera, now seemed to be gazing slightly off to one side, as if distracted by something beyond the frame. Margaret began documenting every change she observed, creating a detailed log with timestamps and descriptions. She photographed the image daily, sometimes multiple times per day, building a comprehensive record of its evolution. The changes were subtle but consistent, and they seemed to be accelerating. Are you fascinated by unexplained phenomena and historical mysteries? Subscribe to our newsletter for more incredible stories that challenge everything you thought you knew about reality. By the end of the first week, Margaret was certain that she was witnessing something unprecedented. The photograph was changing, not just her perception of it, but the actual physical image itself. The silver halide crystals that formed the image seemed to be rearranging themselves, creating new configurations that told a different story than the one originally captured. She began researching the Hartwell family, hoping to find some explanation for what she was witnessing. The local historical society had extensive records dating back to the family's arrival in Massachusetts in the 1692. They had been farmers, merchants, and craftsmen, respectable members of the community with no apparent connection to anything unusual or supernatural. But as Margaret dug deeper into the family's history, she began to uncover strange patterns. Multiple generations of Hartwells had been associated with unexplained phenomena. Reports of time distortions on their property, stories of family members aging at unusual rates, and persistent rumors about their involvement with local folklore concerning temporal anomalies. The most intriguing discovery came from a journal entry written by Ezekiel Hartwell, a described finding what he called time pockets on the family property areas, where clocks would run slow or fast, where seasons seemed to change more rapidly or slowly than in surrounding areas, and where photographs and mirrors sometimes showed images from different time periods. Margaret realized that she might be dealing with something far more significant than a simple archival curiosity. The photograph might be a window into a phenomenon that had been affecting the Hartwell family for generations, a temporal anomaly that somehow allowed images to change and evolve over time, reflecting not just what was, but what had been and what might yet be. As she prepared to delve deeper into her investigation, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that the figure in the photograph were becoming aware of her scrutiny. The elderly man's gaze seemed to follow her as she moved around the archive, and the woman's strange smile appeared to grow more pronounced each day. Margaret's obsession with the photograph had begun to consume her daily routine. She arrived at the archive earlier each morning and stayed later each evening, documenting every minute change in the image. Her colleagues had started to notice her distraction during faculty meetings, and her graduate students complained that she seemed distant during their research consultations. Her documentation had grown into a comprehensive database. She had taken over 200 digital photographs of the original image, each time stamped and annotated with detailed observations. The pattern of changes was becoming clearer, and it was far more complex than she had initially realized. The figures in the photograph weren't just moving, they were aging. The elderly man, who had appeared to be in his 70s in the original image, now showed signs of being even older. New wrinkles had appeared around his eyes, his hair had grown thinner, and his posture had become more stooped. The woman's floral dress had faded slightly, and what had initially appeared to be a vibrant pattern now looked worn and weathered. Most remarkably, the children were growing up before her eyes. The boy, who had appeared to be about 8 years old when she first examined the photograph, now looked closer to 10. His face had lost some of its childish roundness, and he had grown noticeably taller relative to the other figures. The girl showed similar signs of aging, her features becoming more defined and mature. Only the young man in the military uniform seemed to remain unchanged, frozen at what appeared to be his early 20s. Margaret found this particularly intriguing and began to research military records from the early 1960s, hoping to identify him and understand why he alone seemed immune to the temporal effects affecting the others. Her research led her to the local Veterans Administration office, where she spent hours poring over enlistment records and service documentation. She finally found what she was looking for in a file marked Hartwell, James Mike. According to the record, James had enlisted in the army in 1961 and had been killed in action in Vietnam in 1963, just 1 year after the photograph was supposedly taken. This discovery sent chills down Margaret's spine. If James Hartwell had died in 1963, how could he appear unchanged in a photograph that was somehow progressing through time? Was she witnessing some kind of temporal echo, a frozen moment that captured him just before his death? She decided to contact living members of the Hartwell family to learn more about the photograph and the circumstances surrounding its creation. Through the local phone directory and genealogical records, she located Sarah Hartwell Morrison, the great niece of the elderly man in the photograph. Sarah, now in her 60s, lived in a modest house about 20 miles from the university. When Margaret called to request a meeting, Sarah's response was immediate and unsettling. "You found the photograph, haven't you?" Sarah said, before Margaret could even explain the purpose of her call. "I've been wondering when someone would finally notice what it does." They arranged to meet the following afternoon at Sarah's home. Margaret arrived to find a woman who bore a striking resemblance to the girl in the photograph. The same bone structure, the same intelligent eyes, though now lined with age and experience. "That photograph has been in our family for generations," Sarah explained as she served tea in her living room. "Well, not that specific photograph, of course, but photographs like it. They show up every few decades, always depicting family gatherings, always changing over time." Margaret leaned forward, her academic excitement barely contained. "You mean this has happened before?" Sarah nodded gravely. "My great-grandfather wrote about it in his journals. He called them time captures, photographs that somehow got caught between moments, showing not just what was, but what is and what will be. The family has always known about them, but we've learned to keep quiet. People don't react well to things they can't understand." Sarah stood and walked to an old wooden cabinet, from which she retrieved a leather-bound journal. "This belonged to my great-great-grandfather, Ezekiel Hartwell. He was the first to document what he called the time distortions on our property." Margaret took the journal and read aloud. "The land itself seems to hold memories, trapping moments like insects in amber. I have observed that certain locations on our property exist in multiple times simultaneously. A photograph taken in such a place captures not just the present moment, but echoes of past and future as well. The images change as time passes, showing the subjects as they were, are, and will be." According to family records, Sarah continued, "Our property sits on what Ezekiel called a temporal confluence, a place where different time streams intersect. The Native Americans who lived here before us had stories about it too. They called it the place where all seasons meet." Margaret felt a mixture of excitement and skepticism. As a folklorist, she was familiar with local legends and supernatural claims, but she had always approached them from an academic perspective, looking for cultural significance rather than literal truth. This situation was challenging her fundamental assumptions about reality. Despite her reservations, Margaret was determined to visit the site. They drove to what remained of the original Hartwell property, now largely overgrown and abandoned. The farmhouse from the photograph was gone, but its foundation was still visible among the weeds and saplings. As they walked around the property, Margaret began to feel a strange sensation, a subtle disorientation that made her feel as if she were moving through thick air. Her watch seemed to be running slow, and the shadows cast by the trees appeared to shift in ways that didn't match the sun's position. "This is where the photograph was taken," Sarah said, pointing to a level area near the old foundation. "You can feel it, can't you? The way time seems flexible here." Margaret nodded, though she was struggling to process what she was experiencing. As a scientist, she wanted to find rational explanations, but the evidence was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. Margaret's sleep had become fitful and fragmented. She found herself waking at odd hours, compelled to check on the photograph even though the archive was locked and secure until morning. The rational part of her mind insisted that the image couldn't change overnight, but a growing sense of urgency suggested otherwise. When she arrived at the archive on Monday morning, her fears were confirmed. The photograph had undergone its most dramatic transformation yet. The elderly man, who had been aging gradually over the past weeks, now appeared to be in his final days. His face was gaunt and pale, his eyes sunken, and his posture suggested someone barely able to stand. The woman beside him showed signs of deep grief, her forced smile replaced by an expression of profound sadness. Most shocking of all, the two children had aged in teenagers. The boy now appeared to be about 16, with the angular features and awkward proportions of adolescence. The girl, too, had matured dramatically, her childhood innocence replaced by the guarded expression of someone who had experienced loss. Only James, the young soldier, remained unchanged, forever frozen at the moment before his death in Vietnam. Margaret photographed the changes and immediately called Sarah Hartwell Morrison. When Sarah answered, her voice carried a note of resignation that Margaret found deeply unsettling. "It's accelerating, isn't it?" Sarah said before Margaret could speak. "The changes are happening faster now." "How did you know I was calling about that?" Margaret asked. "Because I've been having the dreams again," Sarah replied. "The same dreams my grandmother described in her letters. Dreams about the photograph, about time moving too fast, about the boundaries breaking down." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. "What boundaries?" "The ones that keep different times separate," Sarah explained. "According to family records, this has happened twice before. Once in 1847 and again in 90. Both times, the temporal distortions on our property became so intense that they began affecting the surrounding area. People reported seeing things that hadn't happened yet, or experiencing events from the past as if they were occurring in the present." "What stopped it?" Margaret asked. There was a long pause before Sarah answered. "In 1847, my great-great-grandfather destroyed the photograph that was causing the disturbance. In 1923, my great-grandmother did the same. But each time, the cost was significant." "What kind of cost?" "The photographs weren't just images," Sarah said quietly. "They were somehow connected to the people in them. When the photographs were destroyed, those people changed. Some aged rapidly, others seemed to lose years of their lives. My great-great-grandfather aged 20 years in a single day. After destroying they met in Margaret's office 2 hours later. When Sarah saw the current state of the photograph, her face went pale. "It's worse than I thought," Sarah whispered. "Look at the background." Margaret examined the image more closely and gasped. The farmhouse behind the family, which had appeared solid and well-maintained in the original photograph, now showed signs of decay and abandonment. The windows were broken, the roof was sagging, and ivy had begun to cover the wall. It was as if the photograph was showing not just the aging of the people, but the passage of time on the property itself. "There's something else," Sarah said, pointing to the edges of the photograph. "Do you see that distortion around the board?" Margaret looked more closely and noticed what appeared to be a subtle warping of the image at its edges, as if the photograph were somehow expanding or the boundaries were becoming unstable. "In the family records," Sarah continued, "this was always the final warning sign. When the photographs began to show distortions at their borders, it meant the temporal effects were about to spread beyond the image itself." As if to confirm Sarah's words, Margaret's office clock suddenly began running fast, its second hand moving in rapid, jerky motions. Both women stared at it in alarm as the minute hand advanced several positions in the space of a few seconds. "It's starting," Sarah said grimly. "The temporal distortions are beginning to affect the area around the photograph." Margaret quickly moved the photograph to a secure cabinet and locked it away, but the damage seemed to be done. Her clock continued to run erratically, and she began to notice other subtle changes in her office. The plants on her windowsill appeared to be growing visibly, their leaves unfurling and stems stretching upward at an accelerated rate. "Don't miss out on the shocking conclusion of this incredible story," Follow us for more mind-bending tales that will change how you see the world around you. We need to get it away from populated areas, Sarah said urgently. The longer it stays here, the more people will be affected. In 1923, half the town experienced temporal displacement before my great-grandmother could destroy the photograph. Margaret felt torn between her scientific curiosity and the growing evidence that they were dealing with something genuinely dangerous. The academic in her wanted to study the phenomenon further, to understand its mechanisms and implications, but the rational part of her mind recognized that some discoveries came with too high a price. There has to be another way, Margaret insisted. Some method of containing or controlling the effect without destroying the photograph entirely. This could be the greatest scientific discovery of our time. Sarah shook her head sadly. That's what my great-grandfather thought in me. He tried to study it, to understand it, but the temporal distortions grew stronger the longer he waited. By the time he realized he had to destroy it, 3 people in his family had aged decades in a matter of days, and one had simply disappeared, as if time had erased him entirely. As they debated their options, Margaret noticed that the distortions were spreading beyond her office. Through her window, she could see students walking across the campus quad, but their movements seemed jerky and unnatural, as if they were moving through time at inconsistent rates. Some appeared to be moving in slow motion, while others flickered rapidly from one position to another. The photograph was no longer just changing. It was actively warping the fabric of time around it, creating a growing zone of temporal instability that threatened to engulf the entire university. By Tuesday morning, the temporal distortions had spread throughout the university campus. Margaret arrived to find chaos in the hallways, as students and faculty struggled to cope with the increasingly erratic flow of time. Some classrooms were experiencing time dilation, where 50-minute lectures stretched into what felt like hours. Others were caught in temporal acceleration, with entire seminars compressed into minutes of subjective time. The university's administration was in crisis mode, though they had no framework for understanding what was happening. Official reports described mass hallucinations and collective psychological episodes, but Margaret knew the truth was far more serious. She found Sarah waiting in her office, looking haggard and frightened. "It's getting worse," Sarah said, without preamble. "I've been monitoring the local news reports. There are incidents happening all over the county now. A farmer reported that his crops grew and died in a single day. A family claimed their newborn baby aged into a toddler overnight." Margaret unlocked the cabinet containing the photograph and immediately regretted it. The image had transformed beyond recognition. The farmhouse was now a ruin, completely overgrown with vegetation. The elderly man had vanished entirely, leaving only a faint outline where he had once stood. The woman appeared ancient, her face lined with decades of additional aging. The children were now adults, their faces marked by experiences that had never actually occurred. Only James remained unchanged, his young face a stark contrast to the temporal devastation surrounding him. But most disturbing of all were the new figures that had begun to appear in the photograph. Shadowy forms stood at the edges of the image, people who had never been part of the original scene, but who seemed to be drawn into the temporal vortex the photograph had become. "Those are the missing," Sarah whispered, pointing to the shadow figures, people who got caught in the temporal distortions during the previous incidents. They become part of the photograph, trapped between moments. Margaret stared at the image in horror. "Are you saying these people are still alive? Trapped in some kind of temporal prison?" "We don't know," Sarah admitted. "The family records aren't clear about what happens to them. But every time this has occurred, people have disappeared, and new figures have appeared in the photographs." As they watched, one of the shadow figures became clearer, more defined. Margaret gasped as she recognized the face. It was Dr. Robert Chen, a physics professor from the university, who had been reported missing the previous day. He must have been affected by the distortions, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. Somehow he's been pulled into the photograph itself. The implications were staggering. If the photograph was not just showing temporal changes but actually trapping people within its temporal field, then the danger was far greater than Margaret had imagined. Every person who came into contact with the distortions was at risk of being erased from normal time and imprisoned in the photograph's twisted reality. Margaret's phone rang, startling both women. It was the university president, Elizabeth Morrison, who Margaret suddenly realized shared Sarah's short-term. Dr. Whitmore, the president said, her voice tense with barely controlled panic. I need you in my office immediately. We have a situation that requires your expertise in unusual phenomena. Margaret and Sarah exchanged glances. She's family too, isn't she? Margaret asked. Sarah nodded grimly. My cousin. The family has always tried to keep someone in positions of authority, just in case something like this happened again. They made their way to the president's office, passing through corridors where time seemed to flow like thick syrup. Students moved in slow motion, their voices distorted into deep, incomprehensible drones. In other areas, everything moved so quickly that people appeared as blurs of motion. President Morrison's office was a pocket of relative temporal stability, though Margaret noticed that the clocks on the walls were all showing different times. Dr. Morrison herself looked exhausted, as if she had aged years in the past few days. I've been expecting this call for 20 years, Dr. Morrison said without preamble. My grandmother left me detailed instructions about what to do if the temporal distortions ever returned to our property. I had hoped I would never need to use them. She opened a safe behind her desk and withdrew a thick folder marked Hartwell, Emergency Protocols. Inside were detailed plans for evacuating the affected area, containing the temporal distortions and a finish destroying the source of the phenomenon. Evacuation is already on the way, Dr. Morrison explained. We're telling the media it's a gas leak, but we're actually clearing a 5-mile radius around the university. The National Guard is helping with the operation, though they don't know the real reason. Margaret felt a mixture of relief and dread. Relief that someone in authority was taking the situation seriously, but dread at the implications of such a massive evacuation. What about the photograph? Margaret asked. What do your grandmother's instructions say about destroying it? Morrison's expression grew even more grave. According to the family records, destroying the photograph while it's in an active state could have catastrophic consequences. The temporal energy it's accumulated needs to be discharged gradually, or the sudden release could create a temporal shockwave that affects a much larger area. Then what do we do? Sarah asked. We have to return it to the source, Dr. Morrison replied. Take it back to the exact location where it was created, and perform a specific ritual that my great-great-grandmother developed. It's dangerous. The person who performs the ritual will be exposed to massive temporal distortions, but it's the only way to safely contain the phenomenon. Margaret felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. As the person who had discovered and studied the photograph, she felt obligated to see the situation through to its conclusion, regardless of the personal cost. I'll do it, she said quietly. I started this investigation and I'll finish it. But even as she spoke, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that they were already too late. The photograph had been changing for weeks, accumulating temporal energy and drawing more people into its distorted reality. The ritual might stop the immediate crisis, but the deeper questions about the nature of time, reality and the Hartwell family's connection to these phenomena remained unanswered. And somewhere in the back of her mind, Margaret wondered if destroying this photograph would really end the cycle, or if it would simply reset the countdown until the next temporal anomaly emerged from the cursed ground of the Hartwell property. The evacuation of the university and surrounding area had been completed by Thursday evening. National Guard checkpoints blocked all roads leading to the affected zone, An emergency services had established a command center 5 miles away from the campus. The official story of a chemical leak had held so far, but Margaret knew it was only a matter of time before the truth began to leak out. She stood with Sarah and Dr. Morrison at the edge of the old Hartwell property, watching the sun set over the abandoned farmhouse foundation. The temporal distortions were visible now, even to the naked eye, ripples in the air like heat mirages, areas where the light seemed to bend and twist in impossible ways. The photograph, sealed in a lead-lined case that Morrison had produced from the family's emergency supplies, seemed to pulse with its own malevolent energy. Even through the protective casing, Margaret could feel its influence, a subtle tugging at her perception of time that made her feel dizzy and disoriented. The ritual must be performed at midnight, Dr. Morrison explained, reading from her great-great-grandmother's handwritten notes. That's when the temporal boundaries are thinnest and the photograph's energy can be safely discharged back into the confluence. Sarah had spent a day preparing the ritual site, following instructions that had been passed down through generations of Hartwell women. She had arranged stones in a specific pattern around the farmhouse foundation, each one carved with symbols that predated European settlement of the area. According to the family records, these symbols had been taught to Ezekiel Hartwell by the last surviving member of the local Native American tribe who had recognized the danger the temporal confluence posed. The person performing the ritual will experience severe temporal displacement, Morrison warned Margaret for the third time. You may age rapidly, or you might find yourself experiencing moments from different time periods simultaneously. Some people who have performed this ritual have emerged having lived entire lifetimes in the space of a few minutes. Margaret nodded, though she wasn't sure she truly understood what she was agreeing to. The academic in her was fascinated by the possibility of experiencing time in such a radically different way, but the human part of her was terrified of what she might lose in the process. As they waited for midnight to approach, Margaret found herself thinking about the people trapped in the photograph. Dr. Chen's face had become clearer over the past few days, and she had begun to recognize other missing persons from the area. If the ritual worked, would they be freed from their temporal prison, or would they be lost forever? There's something I need to tell you, Sarah said quietly as they sat around a small campfire, waiting for the appointed time. The family records mention that sometimes, when the ritual is performed, the person doing it doesn't come back the same. They return with memories of things that never happened, knowledge of events that haven't occurred yet. What kind of knowledge? Margaret asked. Future temporal disturbances, Sarah replied. The locations where new photographs will appear, the dates when the cycle will begin again. It's as if performing the ritual connects you to the temporal confluence permanently, making you a guardian of sorts. Margaret considered this revelation. The idea of becoming permanently connected to the phenomenon was both thrilling and terrifying. She would gain unprecedented insight into the nature of time itself, but at the cost of her normal human existence. At 11:45 p.m., they approached the ritual site. The temporal distortions had intensified as midnight approached, creating a swirling vortex of displaced time around the farmhouse foundation. Margaret could see glimpses of different eras superimposed on the present, the original farmhouse, as it had appeared in earlier versions of the building stretching back through the decades, and even older structures that had stood on the site in previous centuries. Morrison handed Margaret a lead-lined case containing the photograph. Once you open this at the center of the circle, there's no turning back, she warned. The temporal energy will be released, and you'll have to complete the ritual or risk being trapped in the confluence forever. Margaret took a deep breath and stepped into the circle of stones. Immediately, she felt the pull of the temporal distortions, as if invisible hands were tugging at her from multiple directions. The world around her began to shift and blur, showing her fragments of different time periods, all occurring simultaneously. She reached the center of the circle and knelt beside the farmhouse foundation. With trembling hands, she opened the case and removed the photograph. The moment it was exposed to the air, the temporal distortions exploded outward in a wave of visible energy. The shocking conclusion awaits sub. Subscribe now to discover how this incredible story ends and unlock access to our exclusive archive of unexplained phenomena that will leave you questioning everything. Margaret found herself experiencing multiple timelines at once. She was simultaneously the young graduate student who had first arrived at the university, the middle-aged professor examining the photograph, and an elderly woman looking back on a lifetime of studying temporal anomalies. She could see the Hartwell family as they had appeared in 1962, but also as they existed across all moments of their lives, children, adults, elderly and beyond. The photograph in her hands was changing rapidly now, cycling through all the transformations she had documented, and many more. She saw the family members aging and growing younger, appearing and disappearing, as if the image were a window into all possible versions of their existence. Following the ritual instructions, Margaret placed the photograph on the foundation stones and began to speak the words that Sarah's ancestor had written down over a century ago. They were in a language she didn't recognize, possibly the Native American dialect that had first identified this place as a temporal confluence. As she spoke, the photograph began to dissolve with silver halide crystals breaking apart and flowing like liquid mercury into the cracks between the foundation stones. The temporal distortions around her intensified and Margaret felt herself being pulled in multiple directions through time. She experienced flashes of the future, other photographs that would appear in decades to come, other investigators who would discover them, other rituals that would need to be performed. She saw herself as an old woman, teaching a new generation of guardians how to contain the temporal anomaly. She saw the university rebuilt and abandoned multiple times, saw the Hartwell property change hands, and return to wilderness and be developed again in an endless cycle. But she also saw hope. Each time the ritual was performed, the temporal confluence grew slightly weaker. The intervals between disturbances grew longer, the effects less severe. Humanity was slowly learning to coexist with the anomaly, to contain its effects without destroying the knowledge it offered about the nature of time itself. As the last of the photograph dissolved into the foundation stones, Margaret felt the temporal distortions beginning to subside. The multiple timelines she had been experiencing collapsed back into a single present moment, though she retained fragmented memories of all the possibilities she had witnessed. She found herself kneeling on the foundation stones, alone in the darkness. Sarah and Morrison were calling her name from outside the circle, but their voices seemed to come from very far away. Margaret tried to stand, but discovered that her body felt different, not older or younger, but somehow more substantial, as if she now existed more fully in time than she had before. Margaret emerged from the ritual circle 3 hours after midnight, though to her it felt as if she had experienced several lifetimes. Sarah and Morrison rushed to help her, noting that, while she appeared physically unchanged, there was something different about her eyes, a depth and distance that suggested she had seen far more than any normal human should. The temporal distortions had completely subsided. The area around the farmhouse foundation was clear and still, with no trace of the rippling effects that had plagued the area for weeks. The evacuation zone was declared safe by dawn, and the National Guard began allowing residents to return to their homes. The official story held. The media reported that a chemical leak had been contained and that the evacuation had been a precautionary measure. The university reopened the following Monday, with most students and faculty attributing their strange experiences during the crisis to stress and mass hysteria. But Margaret knew the truth, and the knowledge weighed heavily on her. She had retained fragments of the temporal vision she had experienced during the ritual, glimpses of future disturbances, knowledge of other temporal anomalies around the world, and an understanding of the delicate balance that kept reality stable. She found that she could now sense temporal distortions before they became visible to others. Walking across campus, she could feel the subtle ebb and flow of time, the places where the past and future pressed close to the present. It was a gift and a burden that she would carry for the rest of her life. Dr. Morrison had offered her a position as the university's unofficial guardian of temporal anomalies, a role that came with access to the Hartwell family's complete archives and the responsibility of monitoring for future disturbances. Margaret had accepted, knowing that her normal academic career was over, but that she now had access to knowledge that could revolutionize understanding of time and reality. Sarah had returned to her quiet life, but she remained in contact with Margaret, serving as a link to the family's oral traditions and historical records. The Hartwell women had been guardians of this secret for generations, and now Margaret had joined their ranks. The photograph itself was gone, its silver Halide crystals absorbed into the foundation stones of the old farmhouse. But Margaret knew it wasn't destroyed. It had simply returned to its source, becoming part of the temporal confluence that had created it. In time, perhaps decades or centuries from now, another photograph would emerge from that same location, and another guardian would need to perform the ritual. The people who had been trapped in the photograph's temporal field had been freed, though most had no memory of their experience. Chin had been found wandering the campus the morning after the ritual, confused but unharmed. He reported having strange dreams about being in an old photograph, but attributed them to stress from the evacuation. Margaret established a new research program at the university, ostensibly focused on folklore and local history, but actually designed to monitor temporal anomalies and train future guardians. She published papers on the psychological effects of historical photographs and the role of family legends in preserving cultural memory, carefully encoding real information about temporal phenomena in academic language that would be meaningless to casual readers but recognizable to others who had encountered similar anomalies. Years passed, and Margaret's reputation grew as an expert on unexplained historical phenomena. She received reports from around the world, photographs that changed over time, locations where time moved differently, families with stories of temporal disturbances stretching back generations. She investigated each case carefully, sometimes finding genuine anomalies that required an intervention, other times discovering natural explanations or simple hoaxes. But she never forgot the lesson of the Hartwell photograph, that time was far more fragile and malleable than most people realized, and that there were places in the world where the boundaries between past, present, and future were thin enough to breach. On quiet evenings, Margaret would sometimes visit the old Hartwell property, now protected as a historical site under the university's care. She would stand on the foundation stones where the farmhouse had once stood and feel the gentle pulse of the temporal confluence beneath her feet. It was dormant now, its energy contained, but she knew it was still there, waiting for the right conditions to create another window into the fluid nature of time itself. The photograph was gone, but its legacy lived on in Margaret's enhanced perception of time and her commitment to protecting the world from the dangers of uncontrolled temporal anomalies. She had become part of a secret tradition stretching back centuries, a guardian of knowledge that most of humanity was not ready to understand. And sometimes, in her dream, Margaret could still see the Hartwell family as they had appeared in that final moment before the photograph dissolved, not as they were in 1962, but as they existed across all of time, eternal and ever-changing, forever captured in the endless dance between what was, what is, and what might yet be. The temporal photograph had revealed one of the universe's most profound secrets, that time itself was not the rigid linear progression that most people believed, but a vast interconnected web of possibilities, where past and future could touch the present in ways that challenged the very foundations of reality. Margaret had been chosen to guard that secret, and she would carry the responsibility for the rest of her days, watching and waiting for the next temporal anomaly to emerge from the hidden places where time forgot to follow its own rules.